The night before sentencing, the lights inside Diddy's Manhattan penthouse burned long past midnight. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. For decades, he had been the man who owned every room he walked into, the parties, the stages, the boardrooms. But that night, the silence was louder than the music that once defined him. According to one insider, he just stared out the window for hours, no TV, no phone, just quiet. Outside, reporters were already camped along the courthouse steps, waiting for the biggest fall from grace the music world had ever seen. It wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a reckoning, one that would test not just a man, but the myth he built around himself. By dawn, the streets were swarmed. Helicopters hovered, fans clutched handmade signs, and every camera in New York pointed toward one destination, the Southern District Courthouse. And at the center of it all, a man once celebrated as untouchable was about to face the one thing money, fame, and power could never silence: justice. But as shocking as the sentence would be, what no one knew was what really happened behind those courtroom doors, and how a few whispered words that day would change everything. By the time the sun rose over Manhattan, the courthouse was already surrounded. Reporters shouted into cameras, fans cried into phones, and lawyers slipped quietly through side doors, pretending the world wasn't watching. But inside Diddy's team, panic had already set in. According to sources close to the defense, the night before the sentencing wasn't just sleepless, it was frantic. Rumors suggest there were last-minute calls to prosecutors, desperate attempts to strike a softer deal. He was willing to do anything to shave off time, one insider said. He just didn't want to die in there. But the prosecution wasn't budging. They wanted to make a statement that power and fame wouldn't protect anyone, not even a man who once stood at the very top of hip-hop's throne. Behind closed doors, whispers said that Diddy's legal team had begged him to stay composed. No eye rolls, no smirks, no emotion. They told him straight up, another report claimed. If you look like you don't care, the judge will bury you. And so, when the morning came, Diddy arrived in silence. No sunglasses, no swagger. Just a beige jumpsuit, shackles, and the weight of a lifetime on his shoulders. Outside, the scene was chaos, helicopters chopping through the air, fans chanting his name, critics holding signs demanding justice. It was part trial, part circus, part history lesson in how fast empires can crumble. One reporter described it best. It didn't feel like a sentencing. It felt like a funeral for everything he ever built. But what no one outside those courtroom walls could see was the tension inside. Federal marshals lined the aisles. Sketch artists set up their easels. Even the journalists whispered, knowing something historic was about to happen.
And when the doors finally closed, the cameras shut off, and the gavel struck once. The noise of the world disappeared. What followed inside that courtroom would haunt everyone who witnessed it. The moment Diddy stepped into the courtroom, the air changed. You could feel it, that strange mix of silence and static before a storm hits. No cameras were allowed, but you didn't need a lens to feel the pressure. Every creak of a bench, every whisper between reporters, every shuffle of the guards sounded deafening. It was as if the room itself knew it was about to witness the end of an era. He moved slowly, wrists shackled, eyes heavy. There was no music, no entourage, no flash of confidence left. Just a man stripped of everything that once made him larger than life. When he sat down, even the judge's clerk hesitated before calling the session to order. Across the aisle, the prosecutors prepared their papers in silence. Their expressions were calm, too calm. People said it looked like they had already won. Behind Diddy sat his defense team, faces pale and focused, flipping through notes they probably wouldn't even use. The gallery was packed. Former associates, family members, journalists, even a few faces from the industry who came quietly, trying not to be seen. Some came out of loyalty. Others came to see the fall up close. Judge Aaron Subramanian entered without a word. Every head turned, every breath in the room seemed to stop. He didn't glance at Diddy at first. He just adjusted his glasses, scanned the papers before him, and said the same 5 words that would start a legal moment the world would never forget. This court is now in session. And in that instant, the noise outside, the chanting, the shouting, the flashing cameras, all disappeared. Inside those walls, there was only truth, power, and the weight of what came next. But before the judge spoke another word, the prosecutor slowly stood, buttoned his jacket, and looked directly at the man once known as one of the most powerful figures in music. That's when the room went dead silent, because everyone knew his next words would cut deeper than any sentence. When the prosecutor rose, the sound of his chair sliding back echoed like thunder. He didn't need to raise his voice. Every word cut through the air with precision, like a blade. "Your Honor," he began, calm but firm, "this case is not about fame. It's not about music. It's about power. And what happens when power is abused without accountability?" The gallery froze. You could hear the faint scribble of pens, the scratch of pencils from the sketch artists, capturing a man who no longer looked untouchable. The prosecutor stepped closer to the bench, his tone turning colder with every word. "For years," he said, "the defendant hid behind his image, a businessman, a mogul, a cultural icon. But behind the luxury, behind the fame, there was something darker. And today that truth is no longer hidden." He paused, warning deliberately, letting his words hang in the air like smoke. Even Diddy didn't move. His hands rested flat on the table, but his fingers trembled slightly, a rare break in composure that the reporters would note later. Then the prosecutor began to recount it all. Not the headlines, no, but the testimonies, the long nights, the names, the stories that had haunted the courtroom for weeks. He spoke of control, of manipulation, of people whose lives were torn apart in silence while the world danced to his music. And then came the line that changed the tone of the entire room. "This isn't the fall of a superstar," he said slowly. "This is the exposure of a man who believed the rules didn't apply to him." You could feel the words sink in. Even the judge leaned slightly forward. What made this moment different wasn't the speech. It was what came after. Because according to sources familiar with the proceedings, prosecutors had prepared a sealed document, a file that wasn't shown publicly, containing details too sensitive to release. Some claimed it included new testimonies. Others whispered it was financial evidence linking Diddy's empire to off-the-record transactions. The defense immediately objected, but the prosecutor didn't back down. He simply said, "The truth always finds its way out, even when people try to bury it in money." The courtroom went completely still. It wasn't just a case anymore. It felt like a reckoning. And as the prosecutor wrapped up his statement, he turned toward Diddy and delivered one final blow. "You built an empire from the dreams of others. But in the end, it's your own decisions that destroyed it." He stepped back, expression blank, voice steady. For a moment, no one breathed, and in that silence, Diddy finally looked up. Just once, his eyes meeting the prosecutor's. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't fear, it was something deeper, a quiet understanding that his story was no longer his own. When the prosecutor sat down, the silence that followed felt endless. All eyes turned toward the defense table, where Mark Agnafilo sat still, his hand pressed to his forehead, eyes fixed on the desk in front of him. He knew what came next would be the hardest speech of his career. Slowly he rose, straightened his tie, took a deep breath. "Your Honor," he began softly, his voice low but steady, "what we just heard was powerful, but it was also incomplete." A few heads in the gallery turned. The judge's gaze lifted. Even Diddy looked up, the faintest flicker of hope flashing across his face. Agnifilo took a step forward. "For months, this courtroom has been filled with stories, some true, some twisted, and some designed to make headlines. But I'm asking this court to see the man beneath the noise, the father, the mentor, the son." He paused. The emotion in his voice cracked just enough to feel real. "This is not a monster," he continued. "This is a man who has made mistakes, yes, but who has also lifted others up. A man who has created opportunities, built communities, and given back to a culture that shaped him." He gestured gently toward his client. "Look at him," he said. "Does he look untouchable now? Does he look like the icon that built a $1 billion empire? No, Your Honor. He looks like what he is. Human, broken, flawed, but still capable of change. Behind him, someone sniffled quietly. Even some of the reporters, hardened by years of covering courtrooms, wrote slower now, their pens dragging as if weighing the emotion of the moment. But what most people didn't know, and what no one dared to say aloud, was that this speech was not the original plan. According to courtroom insiders, Agnifilo had scrapped his prepared statement just hours earlier after reading a private letter Diddy had written from his cell. A letter that, according to one source, ended with the words, "I just need one more chance to prove I can be better than my mistakes." So now Agnifilo spoke from instinct, from heart. He reminded the court that the jury had cleared Diddy of the most serious charges: racketeering, conspiracy, trafficking, and that what remained, though serious, did not define his entire life. He leaned forward on the podium, his tone shifting from pleading to passionate. Justice cannot be about erasing a man's entire legacy. It has to be about balance, redemption, perspective. He paused again, staring directly at the judge. If the goal is accountability, he's felt it. He's lived it. Every headline, every betrayal, every sleepless night in that cell has been punishment in itself. The room went silent. Even the judge seemed to hold his breath. And then in his final words, Agnifilo's voice broke slightly. "Your Honor, I ask you, not as a defense attorney, but as a human being, let this sentence reflect justice, not fury. Let it be fair, not final." He stepped back, exhaling shakily. The moment felt heavy, like time itself was waiting for a decision that would decide not just Diddy's fate, but the legacy of everything he built. Diddy finally raised his head. His eyes glistened, but his face stayed unreadable. He didn't speak. Not yet. Because now the room belonged to one man only, the judge. And when Judge Subramanian finally leaned forward, the quiet was unbearable. The courtroom had gone completely still. No one moved. No one whispered. Even the hum of the air conditioner seemed to stop. Judge Aaron Subramanian leaned forward slowly, hands clasped, eyes heavy behind his glasses. For a moment he said nothing, and that silence was torture. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but every word carried the gravity of a lifetime. "This case," he began, "has drawn attention far beyond these walls. But I am not here for spectacle. I am here for justice." The sound of his voice made Diddy's jaw tighten. His hands twitched against the table, the metal of his chains faintly clinking with each movement. Reporters leaned forward, pens frozen, waiting for the sentence that would headline every screen in the world. The judge continued, his tone growing heavier with every sentence. "The jury has spoken. They found you not guilty of the most severe charges, but they found you guilty of crimes that carry real, lasting consequences. Crimes that exploited, that harmed, that cannot be ignored." He looked up from his notes directly at Diddy. "You've built an empire, Mr. Combs. You've influenced generations. But power in the absence of accountability always collapses. And that is what we are witnessing today." A shiver went through the gallery. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered a prayer. Judge Subramanian's voice dropped lower. "This court recognizes your past contributions, your philanthropy, your cultural impact, but it also recognizes the pain of those who came forward. The court cannot and will not allow wealth or fame to rewrite the law." He paused again. The silence that followed was unbearable. Then came the words that made the air leave the room. "Mr. Combs," the judge said, his tone now iron sharp, "please rise." The chains around Diddy's wrists rattled as he stood. He stared straight ahead, eyes fixed on nothing, his chest rising and falling as if trying to brace for impact. "Do you have anything to say before I deliver your sentence?" The question hung in the air. For a few seconds, he said nothing. Then, in a voice so low it barely carried across the room, he muttered, "I've made mistakes, but I'm not the monster they think I am." The judge nodded once, slowly, and then, in a single breath that shattered the silence, he delivered the words that would echo across every news outlet, every timeline, every studio in America. "Sean Combs, this court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison." The gallery erupted. Gasps, shouts, the sound of someone crying out before being hushed by a bailiff. Reporters nearly dropped their pens. The defense table went still. Agnifilo closed his eyes. Diddy didn't move. At first it looked like he didn't even hear it. Then his shoulders sank and his head tilted forward, like the air had just been punched out of him. The gavel struck once, sharp, final. "This court is adjourned." And just like that, the empire was gone. Not with an explosion, not with a scandalous party or a headline-grabbing arrest, but with a single sentence that echoed louder than any track he'd ever produced. The sound of the gavel still echoed when the first cry broke through the silence. A woman's voice, sharp, cracking, desperate. "No!" It cut through the room like glass. A bailiff moved instantly, hands raised for calm, but the damage was done. The emotion, the shock, it spread like wildfire. Reporters sprang to life, pens racing across notepads, whispers flying between rows. Some were trembling, some were speechless. Even seasoned journalists who'd seen it all just sat frozen, their eyes locked on the man in chains standing at the center of it all. Diddy didn't move. He stood there, eyes low, face unreadable, as if his body was still present, but his mind was already somewhere far away. The chains around his wrists caught the light, a metallic reminder that this wasn't a dream. This was reality. Behind him, his lawyer, Mark Agnifilo, tried to whisper something, maybe a promise of appeal, maybe an apology. But Diddy didn't answer. He just nodded once, slow and heavy, as guards began to close in. Across the room, the prosecutors packed up their files, their faces expressionless. To them, it was over. To everyone else, it had only just begun. And then came the quiet, that strange, unnatural quiet that feels almost sacred, the kind of silence that falls after history happens. Courtroom sketch artists stopped drawing. Spectators stared at the floor. Some of Diddy's supporters quietly wept. Others simply shook their heads, unable to process what they'd just witnessed. One reporter later said, "It felt like time froze. You could hear the sound of his chains every time he breathed." And that's when it hit everyone. The king had fallen. When the guards finally stepped forward to escort him out, Diddy turned just once, not toward the judge, not toward the cameras, but toward the public benches, where a few familiar faces sat with tears in their eyes. He didn't speak. He didn't wave. He just stared for one long, silent moment before the guards pulled him away. As he disappeared through the door, the courtroom exhaled all at once. The noise returned, the reporters shouting questions, the families crying, the shuffle of people rushing toward the exits. But through it all, one sound lingered, the faint, rhythmic clinking of chains fading down the hallway. The empire wasn't just gone, it was being led away, link by link, into the past. The doors of the courtroom hadn't even shut before the world outside exploded. As Diddy was led out through a side corridor, the sound from beyond the walls hit like a thunderstorm. Shouting reporters, flashing cameras, fans crying his name. The marble floors trembled beneath the stampede of feet trying to get closer, to see history up close. When the courthouse doors finally opened, the scene was chaos. Sirens wailed, camera shutters fired like machine guns. A sea of microphones and flashing lights collided as security shouted, "Clear the path! Move back!" And then, there he was, Sean Diddy Combs, wrists shackled, head bowed, flanked by federal guards. No sunglasses, no jewelry, no entourage. Just the man who once ruled the culture, now reduced to an image no one thought they'd ever see. The crowd's reaction split instantly. Half screamed his name, some in disbelief, some in anger, some in heartbreak. The other half booed, chanting, "Justice! Justice!" Their voices echoing off the courthouse walls like a war chant. One fan yelled, "They set him up!" Another shouted back, "He got what he deserved!" It was chaos, the kind that only happens when a legend falls in real time. News anchors scrambled to go live. On one side of the street, networks framed it as the collapse of an empire. On the other, headlines read, "Justice finally served." Reporters shouted over each other, desperate for a quote, a reaction, a moment of emotion that could lead the evening broadcast. Inside the press vans, phones buzzed nonstop. Clips of the sentencing spread online faster than wildfire. The moment the judge said 25 years, replayed in slow motion, captioned, memed, dissected. Twitter, or X, went nuclear. Hashtags like hashtag Diddy sentenced, hashtag Empire collapse, and hashtag 25 years trended within minutes. Some users posted old videos of Diddy celebrating success with captions like, "The higher you rise, the harder you fall." Others defended him, saying the justice system had gone too far. Instagram flooded with think pieces, screenshots of court quotes, and fan tributes that blurred the line between mourning and disbelief. TikTok became an echo chamber of reaction videos, tears, rants, and conspiracy theories, each racking up millions of views. And while the internet fought its usual war, the industry went silent. No statements, no posts, just silence. The kind that says more than any PR line ever could. Behind the scenes, insiders claimed several brands and collaborators cut ties within hours. One major label executive allegedly told reporters off record, "This isn't just a scandal, it's fallout. Everyone's running for cover." For years, Diddy had been the heartbeat of hip-hop's luxury, the blueprint for turning art into empire. Now that same empire was collapsing live on every platform, every screen, every feed. And as the prison van pulled away under flashing lights, one journalist's voice caught on a live mic, whispering the line that summed it up best. The king just lost his crown. While the world outside screamed and the cameras feasted on chaos, a different kind of collapse was already unfolding behind closed doors. The real damage wasn't just emotional. It was financial, legal, and irreversible. Within hours of the sentencing, Diddy's empire began to unravel piece by piece. Accounts frozen, contracts terminated, partners silent. Insiders described it as a business meltdown in real time. One executive from his liquor brand claimed that the moment the 25-year sentence hit the wire, the boardroom phones wouldn't stop ringing. Investors demanded immediate withdrawal. Marketing agencies pulled campaigns overnight. What took decades to build, from Bad Boy Records to Sean John, from Ciroc deals to global partnerships, began disintegrating faster than anyone expected. But that was only the surface. According to reports circulating in the legal community, federal investigators weren't finished. They were allegedly reviewing financial records, revisiting old contracts, and quietly contacting individuals who'd once worked closely with Diddy. "They want to see how deep this goes," said one attorney, familiar with the case. Some claim there were sealed documents still unaccounted for, potentially linking offshore funds, private investments, and confidential settlements. None of it confirmed, but the whispers grew louder each day. And while lawyers debated the next steps, the music industry reacted with brutal efficiency. Collaborations disappeared from playlists. Brand endorsements were scrubbed. You could search his name on streaming platforms one day and see it buried under disclaimers the next. One producer said off record, "It's like they're erasing him in real time. Like the industry decided he never existed. Even artists he once helped launch began distancing themselves. Publicists crafted careful statements, full of empathy, but empty of loyalty. And behind all of it, one question haunted every label, every boardroom, every conversation in hip-hop. Who's next? Because this wasn't just Diddy's collapse. It was a warning, a message that even the most powerful could fall, and when they do, the system doesn't just punish, it devours. Meanwhile, inside the prison transport van, Diddy sat in silence. According to one source close to the family, he didn't say a word for the entire ride. He just stared at his hands. Hands that once signed million-dollar deals, now shackled together by cold metal. It was more than a fall from grace. It was the slow disintegration of everything he had built, the legacy he once thought would outlive him. And for the first time in his life, there was no crowd, no cameras, no applause. Just the sound of tires rolling over cracked pavement, carrying him further away from the world he once ruled. The van disappeared down the street, swallowed by the chaos it left behind. Reporters still shouted, cameras still flashed, but for the first time in decades, Diddy was silent. No entourage, no spotlight, no soundtrack to drown out the truth. Inside that steel van sat a man who once defined an entire era. A man who turned ambition into an empire, and then watched it collapse beneath the weight of his own choices. And yet, even as the headlines screamed, something deeper began to form. Not just outrage, but reflection. Because this wasn't just the story of one man's downfall. It was a mirror for fame, for power, for the industry that built him up and then turned away when the spotlight shifted. In studios across the country, young artists whispered his name like a cautionary tale. Don't get too big. Don't get too loud. Don't think it can't happen to you. For a culture that once celebrated him as untouchable, the silence that followed was deafening. Analysts called it the end of an era. Fans called it a tragedy. But those who truly knew the business saw something else. A cycle repeating itself, just with a different name at the center. And while Diddy's lawyers prepared appeals and journalists chased new stories, the world had already moved on to the next headline. That's the irony of power. It never pauses for the people who lose it. Still, for millions watching around the world, one image refused to fade. Diddy, head bowed, wrist bound, surrounded by guards. The man who once walked red carpets, now walking into history as a cautionary symbol. Because in the end, it wasn't just a sentence. It was a statement. One that said no empire, no matter how rich or legendary, can survive when built on the illusion of being untouchable. The echoes of that courtroom still linger, in songs that will never sound the same, in fans who still can't believe it, in a culture forced to question what it truly values. And maybe that's the legacy now. Not the fame, not the fortune, but the fall, the reminder that even kings bleed when the crown gets too heavy. So the question remains, was this justice? Or was it the system finally proving that no one, not even Diddy, is above the law? Whatever the answer, one thing is certain. The day the empire fell, the music didn't stop. It just changed forever.